what I have noticed, like with professional athletes here, like in the NBA or NFL, even Major League Baseball, I've noticed, and maybe they're more cognizant of it, but as they get older, they realize, oh my God, I'm not recovering the way I did when I was 21. Yeah. So all of a sudden they're like, I better change my nutrition, focus on sleep. And it's like, imagine if they did that when they were 21 versus now they're in their mid 30s. It's like Tom Brady's doing something right. The fact they could play football and be 45 years old. Yeah. And I think part of it is, when you look at his diet or training, it's like, okay, there's some weird stuff going on, but part of it might be in what he doesn't do. Maybe he doesn't stay out late. Maybe he doesn't drink too much. Maybe, in fact, I don't even know if he drinks. Well, he did drink at the Super Bowl when they won.
Yeah, exactly. He probably only drinks for a couple months, and then once he's back on, he seems like that type of personality that,
So he might be avoiding those behaviors that tend to just be not good for you versus a lot of, we always want to see, okay, what are they doing? What are they doing? Whether it's diet or sleep or whatever, when in fact, you might want to step back and say, yeah, but look what they're not doing. And look what those other guys are doing. And maybe that's why he can play, still be healthy at 45, and he can still sling the ball. I mean,
yeah.
I don't know about you. Have you thrown a baseball lately?
Yeah, I used to throw a lot of baseballs back in the day. And now when
you were a baseball player.
And now when I throw one, I can hear all of the noises. It's like,
if I used to coach my kids when they played softball. And so I got used to, throwing with them, but I had to warm up a long time. Yeah. Like I remember as a kid, I could just get a ball and fling it. I could just fling it. Now I'm like, if someone says, hey, let's play catch, I'm like, could I warm up for a long time?
I'll need 40 throws just to get the blood flowing.
Right. So that's why when I see a 45-year-old playing professional football, I'm like, wow, whatever he's doing, it's certainly crazy out of the ordinary. And because you and I can't even throw a dang ball.
Yeah, no, it is, incredible. And, I guess maybe on that note, if we shift gears a little bit and talk about, biomarkers, lab testing, recovery, whether it's the collegiate athlete, whether it's some of the pro athletes or endurance athletes that you work with, what are some of the tests that are staples for you? And
what's interesting is, I've talked to some of my colleagues about looking at heart rate variability. Can't really do blood tests because the average athlete, you're not going to have access to any blood tests. So it's the typical stuff like heart rate variability, sleep quality, and whatnot. It's funny, and I do this with myself. I always go back to, and this sounds kind of crazy, I always go back to, how do you feel? Yeah. Because I do that to myself. I have a watch that measures everything. I'm like, okay, well, my heart rate was this and this and that.
Yeah.
The next day I should be recovered, but the next day I feel like crap. And I'm like, whoa. And it's the same with athletes I'd work with. It's like, okay, you feel like crap, even though technically you slept really well. So do you go by the number on your watch or do you go by how you feel? And even during training, I don't know if you do this. I don't know. Do you do a lot of cardio?
Less than back in the day, but still some, yeah.
Okay, so I do a lot of paddling. They have stand-up paddling races in Florida, right? Because awesome. It's warm, so you could literally race all year. And I have a watch that measures everything: stroke rate, stroke distance. I have all this information, but then when it gets down to it, I'm like, okay, basically, if I wake up and I feel really good, I'll train hard. So here I am, a scientist being, just go by how you feel. And others need the number. Like, for instance, for a while I did a self-experiment. I'm like, I'm going to use heart rate as a gauge of training intensity, and so I can determine what my volume is. And for whatever reason, heart rate and level of perceived exertion or perceived effort, a lot of times it just didn't match. I'm like, okay, my heart rate is low, but I feel like I'm killing myself, or my heart rate's high, and I'm like, whoa, I feel really good. So I've quit the heart rate stuff. Now I'm back to just perceived exertion, because I go back and forth. I'm like, okay, I'm going to wear my heart rate monitor, see what happens. I'm like, but sometimes there's this weird mismatch, and I'm like, you know what? Sometimes the old school stuff of you wake up, how do you feel? Mm-hmm. Do you feel like you slept well? Is almost good enough. I'm not sure it's good enough. I'm not sure it's good enough for everybody, but it seems to be good enough. And that's what let's face it, that's what coaches did in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. It's like, how do you feel?
Yeah. I guess it's the nature of a complex problem, isn't it? There's so many inputs that we can't know all the inputs, and something's being influenced, and it's like we're trying to tease it out to these sort of 3 or 4 metrics, but there's just so many more things. I mean, mental, emotional state, like you say, sleep and everything else, hydration status. And so
Yeah,
it is interesting that if you go back to sort of the heuristics or kind of the wisdom side of how do you feel, and it's actually over time a pretty good marker of
it seems to work most of the time. So it's yeah, it's interesting how the more technology we get, the more now we have all this data, but we're not sure what to do with all this data. It's sort of like I have a friend who trains a lot of mixed martial arts fighters.
mhm.
So how does he train them? Well, it's basically you train by feel. I mean, you still go through the typical strength and conditioning, but there's things you can measure, but at the end of the day, is it a predictor of anything? And the answer is, well, no, it's kind of not predictor of anything. But I think we like to think we have more control over how the human body responds than we really have. Because maybe that makes us feel better. We're like, well, your heart rate variability was this yesterday, and now it's this. So we're going to dial back on your training. And the God's honest truth, we don't know. We don't freaking know.
It's tough, especially as you get away from endurance sport, right? I mean, I actually had Dr. Corey Peacock on a few seasons ago, and he was talking about Kamaru Usman and even using Omega Wave and things. And basically, the score always came back crappy, but he felt great and looked great and everything. So then you just, like you say, you're going by feel and I guess the practitioner's perspective and then the athlete's perspective and sort of marrying those up, and then using the data as sort of a background information, but you can't let it steer things too much, can you?
No, and in fact, I've always asked myself, okay, if there's a metric or a couple metrics I would use, we'll separate endurance stuff from the strength power stuff, would give me somewhat useful information. And then with the endurance stuff, I go back to heart rate because, okay, it may not be perfect, but it gives you something.
Yeah.
With the strength power stuff, I can't think of anything. I don't know what it is other than, if you're coaching someone, it's almost by feel. But I can't think of a objective assessment that, we think you're going to do real well in that powerlifting meet. Other than we've watched you train, we see how your volume's gone up or weight's gone up or whatever. I can't think of that metric, so it's really tricky. It's really tricky. And I mean, I guess someone is coming up with a metric somewhere to determine, as a way of gauging athletic improvement. But then when you deal with the team sports, forget it. It's almost too complicated. Like, we say American football is the most complicated team sport because there's so many moving parts. You could literally have the best play that's called by the offensive coordinator, but all it takes is one guy to mess up. One guy messes up, and it's like, whoa, everyone else knew what they were doing, but that one guy messed up and
the play crumbles.
Yeah. And I think, that's what makes, I think that's what makes our field fun, because we're trying to put a box around it and understand it. But again, there's so many variables, and I guess that's what makes it interesting to study. And that's
Absolutely.
why, that's why
closer and closer to the truth, but there's still, it's so complex, isn't it?